we had a deadlock, northern states versus southern states. And again, the issue is power in Congress. Northern states will get more power in Congress if we don't count slaves. Southern states will get more power in Congress if we do count slaves. It's simple. It's just math, and it's a hard issue. What do we do? What do we do? How do we decide this question? Well, again, they came up with a compromise. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the 3/5 compromise, because they decided that they would have slaves counted as 3/5 the same as white. They could have done it halfway, but they came up with 3/5 instead. And it's a long story. I don't want to take the time to tell you the story of how they came up with 3/5 as opposed to counting them at half or something like that. Half would seem to be a middle ground, but they said 3/5. So we settled that, and now we're back on track, and we can go on to all the other issues that we have to deal with to come up with a constitution. But I want to make sure that you understand at this point that at the convention, slavery became an issue. It's a very serious issue, and there's a time when it almost sidetracked the whole convention. I mean, if they hadn't come up with that 3/5 compromise, again, everybody would have gone home, and it would have been the end of it. But that's what they were talking about when they talked about slavery. They were only talking about the question of whether we're going to have slaves counted for determining the population, for determining the membership of the House, or not. The issue of whether we should have slavery or not didn't come up. They're not wanting to talk about that. Now, there was one time when one delegate from Pennsylvania raised the question, and I don't know anything about him. I don't know if he was a Quaker or not. Quakers were people, in Pennsylvania, ever since the days of William Penn, it had a large Quaker population, and Quakers were about the only people in America who really thought slavery was wrong. So this member here, this delegate, may have been a Quaker. But he said, hey, you know what? We're talking about slavery here, and all we're talking about is whether we count them as for population or not. Maybe we should ask ourselves if we really want to have slavery. And everybody just went nuts. And, oh, shh! Don't talk about that! Don't talk about that! We don't want to talk about that. And I told you it's because when I was telling you about slavery before, and the issue of whether you'd have slavery in the Northwest and the Northwest Territory, there were people in America, and the one that comes to mind is John Adams, who disliked slavery. But like other people who disliked slavery, he could never get over two obstacles. One was, what are we going to do with the slaves after we free them? If we abolish slavery, if we emancipate the slaves, then what do they do? And there's an obvious answer: they just become regular people. But even the people who didn't like slavery couldn't accept that. They still were linked in to the idea that America was going to be a white person's country. And the other obstacle was that slaves were property. They couldn't get that out of their head. They couldn't see beyond the idea that slaves were property. And as property, you can't take them away from their owners. That's, the government is there to protect their property, not to deprive people of their property. So yeah, you could compensate, and there were people who said, well, let's just compensate them. But once you start thinking about that, and you look at how many slaves there are and how much they cost, it's way too much money, and nobody can afford it. So we can't deal with this, and it's like your mind just goes blank because you want to get rid of slaves, maybe, if you don't like slavery, and of course many people did. Many people depended on slaves. But even if you don't, even if you're one of the people who says that slavery is wrong, then you ask yourself the question, well, then if we abolish slavery, what do we do, and how do we pay for them? So you just shut up. It's like your mind shuts down when it deals with an impossible question. And for Americans in general, as of 1787, Slavery was an impossible question. So they didn't want to talk about it at Philadelphia. They made references to it. They insisted that the slaves would be, if they ran away, that it would be responsible to get them back. And they said Congress could not abolish the importation of slaves. They didn't use the word slaves, but could not abolish the importation of labor for 20 years. So there's provisions in there, but they didn't deal directly with the fundamental question of whether we should have slavery or not. And that's going to be, as we see for the rest of this semester, that's going to be the overriding question that this country has to face. We just have to deal with the question of slavery, and nobody wanted to do it. So they went on, they adopted it, all right, they got it done. So they didn't deal with the basic question of whether we're a federation of states or a nation. They didn't deal with the fundamental question of whether we're going to have slavery or not, but they got around it so they can go on and do the rest of their work. Now, one of the reasons why they were comfortable with the idea of two houses of Congress, which I told you was, people are familiar with that, that's what they know. And they've always had two houses of Congress, or the two houses of Parliament, and that's what this is based on, and that had been true for hundreds of years. And underlying it was kind of a thought that nobody really put into words until little Jimmy Madison did. And that's the idea that these two houses of Congress are going to kind of offset each other. And even in England, going back hundreds of years, Parliament, they'd always kind of liked the idea of having two houses of Parliament because they kind of offset each other. It kind of took two to get something done, and they both sort of had to agree. And they sort of felt that was a good idea, that you'd have two people that would have to agree on something. And if they didn't agree, then maybe there's some reason why they should talk it out or something like that, and that'll give you an excuse to kind of look things more carefully and think about it, and you'll come up with better decisions. You've got two people thinking it instead of just one. But they didn't put it into words. They didn't think about it clearly. They didn't do it explicitly. It was just sort of kind of understood. Madison expressed it very clearly. The phrase that we'll use here is checks and balances. Checks and balances. And they wanted to have the two houses of Congress sort of checking each other. And that makes good sense to these people because these guys at the convention, these are educated people. These are the, sort of the better off people. They're the well-to-do people. They're the people who are members of their state legislatures in many cases. Most of them have were currently in their state legislature or had been or had experience in public life. They tend to be better off economically than most Americans. They tend not to be the farmers. More of them are merchants or people who have invested in various types of monetary bases. So, they're a little bit better off and so forth. And they knew what was going on. They were all committed to a republic. They all believed in the necessity of having a republic, and they believed in the necessity of having a government based on the consent of the governed. People have to consent to things through representatives. That was what was wrong with the Stamp Act. It was passed by Parliament without any consent, without any input from Americans. And you can't do that. The government has to have some input from the people. So they wanted to be representatives of the people. But they wanted it to be representatives because, on the one hand, yeah, we want the people to have to be represented, but we don't really trust the people. The terms that these delegates to the convention used a lot of times when they talked about the people were passion. People got carried away by emotions. People could get kind of lose sight of their rationality when they got into mobs. It's the mob psychology that you have to watch out for. Mob rule is what the people are inclined to. especially if they're led by demagogues out there, getting to shout things, lock her up or other chants just to be sort of take advantage of the mob mentality. And you've got to guard against that. You can't let that go. So that's why you have representatives. And the idea is that the representatives are going to be like themselves, like the delegates themselves, the better off people, the educated people, the finer people, maybe richer, but you don't have to be rich, but that's usually comes with it. But it's the idea that you're just educated and responsible, and they're going to be your representatives. But even they might give in to the pressure of the mob. So that's why you don't necessarily want to have a single Congress deciding things and be the ultimate authority. What you want is, the House of Representatives is going to be sort of more vulnerable to mob rule and to mob impulses because they're going to be elected by the people. But you like the idea then that the Senate is there to kind of act as a check on the House, because the Senate is going to be elected by state legislatures. And the state legislatures are, of course, elected by the people because all power has to come from the people. But it'll be sort of filtered out. You're going to have the people elect their state legislatures, and then the legislatures maybe going to be a little bit sober, more reasoned and thinking and careful. And then they're going to elect the senators, and the senators aren't immediately responsible to the people, and that's good. And it gives them a chance to sort of be back there and think about things a little bit. Ultimately, their power has to come from the people. They're got to be elected by their legislatures, and the legislatures have got to be elected by the people. But we hope that maybe that'll kind of moderate it a little bit and act as sort of a little sobering thought, so that the mob won't just rule the whole Congress. It may rule in the House, but the Senate maybe will act as sort of a check on it, and that's what they want. They want to have people check. They don't want to give anybody too much power. They don't want to give absolute power. I mean, they knew about absolute power. They'd been colonists, and they didn't want it. That's the whole point, is not to have absolute power. So they have checks and balances. The House would check the Senate, and the Senate would check the House. And then, as I hope you know, they added another check and balance on that. We're going to have a president. And so the president is going to be the executive branch and will act as a check on Congress. And, that England had always had those three, the same counterparts. The House of Commons, like the House of Representatives. The House of Lords, which is sort of like the Senate, a little bit different because the House of Lords is hereditary, but, it's sort of the idea. And then they'd had the king, and the king could sort of also act as sort of a check on Parliament. But it wasn't until Madison came along and really put it clearly that this is checks and balances, and he talked about the legislative branch and the executive branch. Now, England had always had Parliament and the king. All of our state constitutions had a state legislature and a governor. But nobody put it in terms of checks and balances. And they put it in terms of the legislative branch and the executive branch until Jimmy Madison. And that's why I think he's the greatest political scientist we've ever had in this country. He was a brilliant guy. And it's just genius that he came up with this idea of having an executive branch that could check the legislative branch, and the legislative branch could check the executive branch. And through this process of veto, and then the Congress can override the veto. So that was important to have checks and balances. That's fundamental to preserving the Republican form of government. That's fundamental to preserving liberty in America. Freedom depends upon checks and balances. Because if you give anybody too much power, they will abuse it and they'll take away people's rights. That's why it's all about. We've got to have checks and balances to protect us against absolute power. Nobody can have absolute power in America. You got to have somebody check on that. Then, of course, they had to figure out at the convention how to elect the president. Well, just as you don't want to have the president too close to, or you don't want the Senate close to the people, you certainly don't want the president close to the people. So they're not going to have the president elected by the people. They don't want him to be responsible to the people because he might give in to their demagogic impulses, to their mob rule. He might become victimized by mob rule, or God forbid, he might lead it himself. So they didn't want to have the president elected by the people, and they came up with the idea of the Electoral College. The Electoral College. It's going to be sort of combining the House and the Senate, and that each state would have a number of electors equal to its number of representatives in the House, which is based on population, plus 2, the number of senators, which is so that each state is equal. So it's sort of combining the principles of the House and the Senate, the principles of the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. And we're going to have the Electoral College elect the president. Now, how did you get to be an elector? Well, the Constitution leaves that up to each state. Each state decides how it will choose its electors. In the early years, most states had their legislature elect elect the electors, and then the electors elect the president. Today, and since about the 1820s, all states let the people elect the electors. And that's what we're actually doing. When we have our election this coming November, we will not be voting for the president. The people do not elect the president. The people elect the electors, and the electors elect the president. So you've got to make that clear. The president is not, although sometimes there have been times when presidents have said that they were chosen by the people. No, presidents are not elected by the people. They are elected by the Electoral College. In most cases, that's the same, so it doesn't matter. It's just a matter of terminology, and it doesn't have any practical differences because the people in the Electoral College, they choose the same people. Sometimes it doesn't happen that way. And then you've got a president who is not elected by the people. He's elected by the electors who overruled the people. The Electoral College overrule the people and say, no, you want this person, but that's not the way it works. We're going to have somebody else. You don't get to choose the president. So, and they wanted that because they don't really trust the people, and it'll make the system of checks and balances work better. The president can be a check. Alexander Hamilton wanted a president elected for life, so that the president wouldn't ever have to worry about going to the people. They don't want a president who cares about the people. Hamilton wanted a president who could govern without respect to the people. But that was going too far. That sounded too much like monarchy. And so Hamilton's plan was totally rejected. Nobody wanted his plan. And he had a hard time with that because it was sort of his idea that they had this convention, and then they turned his ideas down. But we adopted the president elected by the Electoral College. And it's based on the system of checks and balances. There's one little bit more feature of that we have to talk about.